Welcome, everyone. It's my great joy to have you here for this really important conversation on the topics of mining, governance, and social progress. My name is Rohitesh Dhawan, or Ro for short, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's conversation with a wonderful group of panelists. The backdrop for today's conversation is provided by a report that we at ICMM have launched just this morning, and you will see the link to it in the chat. On achieving social progress and the role of governance in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I really encourage you to read the report. It is a really interesting read, and I hope today's conversation whets your appetite to do just that. I promise you a really great conversation because the four people I have with me are really the best people to be talking to us about these issues today. Let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll dive straight in. So first off, we have the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Helen, welcome. You are the chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, a partnership we deeply, deeply value. So thank you for being with us. We have Philippe Noche, the chief executive of Orano, one of the ICMM member companies. Philippe, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ro. Hello.
So, and then we have Sunita Kaimal, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Natural Resources Governance Institute, or NRGI. Sunita and I have actually been in our jobs for about the same amount of time, Sunita, so it's wonderful to have you.
Lisa, thank you so much.
No, pleasure to have you. And Lisa, the Chief People and Sustainability Officer at Newcrest, one of our other member companies. Lisa, thanks very much.
Lovely to be here.
And Lisa and Helen, appreciate it's very late for you both down in Australia and New Zealand respectively. So thank you very much for being here in particular. Look, the conversation we're going to have today is actually quite personal for me. You know, I've been in this job for 3 months now. And of course, Sunita, as I'm sure you've been getting asked, I've been getting asked, well, why did you decide to do this and what's behind it? And I actually think that the answer lies in the report. Because what the report helps us see is how mining can be an incredibly powerful force for development in countries where it plays a really significant role. And what this piece of work does is it helps us see through a detailed set of 41 indicators that have been grouped together under the 12 SDGs across 23 years looking back to see what contributions the resources sector has made to social progress in these economies. Now, if you take nothing away from today's conversation, there are just two things I'd love for you to keep in mind, which are really the key findings of this report. The first is that mining-dependent countries, and we'll come to talk about how we define them in a minute, but mining-dependent countries have been closing the gap with countries that are non-resource dependent on socioeconomic factors. So the upshot of that really is that something that we've all, I'm sure, thought about, this idea of a resource curse, the idea that resources tend to hold development back, actually just doesn't play out in the data that we've been able to gather over the last 23 years. So that's the first really interesting thing we're going to get into. And the second is that the quality of governance really matters. Now, that might seem like a really obvious thing, but the point to make here is that the wider governance structure in a country really determines whether their citizens will be healthier, better educated, wealthier than if those wider governance structures didn't exist. And it takes time. It just doesn't happen overnight. So look, those are the two key takeaways from the report. Lots of really interesting detail to get into, which I'm really looking forward to talking through. The session is being recorded, as you saw, and it will be available after that. And what we're going to do is have a really pre-ranging conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So do pop in your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll make sure that we have a chance to get to them. So look, let's kick off. And I thought we would start really, really broad, because when we say governance, so we're talking here about the quality of governance and the effect that has on social progress in mining-dependent countries. I thought we might just start very broad by saying, what does good governance look like? You know, what does it look like? What's good governance, and why is it important? So Sunita, I might start with you, please, and then we'll move on to Helen after that, and Philippe, and then Lisa. And Sunita, you, of course, before NRGI, have had a really rich career in a host of not-for-profit sectors and civil society groups. And I would just love your perspective on this question of what does good governance look like? Why is it important?
Thank you so much, Ro. So as you said, put quite simply, when natural resources are governed well, both locally and globally, then people and the planet can prosper. But when they are poorly governed, then we see corruption and conflict and inequality and environmental destruction, and poverty really run rampant. So frankly, this has long been true. And maybe a better question for us to ask is, why does good governance matter in this sector now more than ever before? And there are a few trends that I'd like to highlight. So first of all, more people are poor than ever before. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we have seen the first rise in global poverty since 1998. And it is estimated that about half of the world's population who are poor will live in resource-rich countries by 2030. That's a really disturbing trend. Secondly, the funds to alleviate poverty were already scarce to begin with. There were questions about whether they were sufficient to meet the SDGs, and that's true even more so now for developing economies, because we've seen disruptions in supply chains, commodity price fluctuations, and as a result, countries are actually in greater debt. And then thirdly, we're also seeing that companies and countries are trending in some of the wrong directions at this critical juncture. Too many governments, too many companies are racing to the bottom instead of striving to the top. And that means considering a growing number of inappropriate incentives or trade-offs that prioritize short-term revenue needs instead of that longer-term economic well-being that we're really all striving towards. So I think in this moment, when we think about building back better, when we think about cleaner and greener and healthier people and economies, that depends on us stepping up, not stepping back on governance in natural resources and in mining specifically, because we know the path to renewable energy, the path to renewed economies may be paved with critical minerals whose demand and whose prices are really surging. So what does that look like? What is good governance that we're all striving towards? Governance is really about norms and institutions and processes that define power, that define benefits and define decision making. And so what we're looking for is the disclosure of timely and relevant information by both companies and governments, but also the ability of civil society to actually use that information. We're also looking for informed, inclusive, meaningful dialogue on how resources are governed that's guided by citizen priorities with proper oversight and with capacitated institutions. And lastly, we're looking for an enabling environment that upholds human rights and rule of law and the equitable distribution of that resource wealth. So if I could put it simply, I would say good governance in natural resources is really about transforming potential into prosperity.
Lisa, thank you. Helen, I'd love to hear your perspective. Besides, of course, occupying the highest political office in your home country, New Zealand, you were the UNDP administrator amongst many other positions you've held. And through that, Helen, you would have seen experiences around the world. So we'd just love your sense of what does good governance look like and why is it important?
Well, thanks very much, and really fascinating to hear about the research that's been done, and it's encouraging actually to see findings which say that in mining-dependent countries, things are better in human development. No doubt they could be much better still, but if the trend's in the right direction, we can all take encouragement. And secondly, the finding that governance matters, of course, is like milk and honey to me and to EITI, because we do believe it matters. Look, I come from a small, open, transparent democracy, which year on year in the Transparency International survey of corruption perceptions comes out as either first equal or second on the being the least corrupt in the world. This matters to me. I believe that the natural resources of a country belong to its citizens. I believe that if they are extracted and there's value extracted from that, the citizens have to benefit. We see very high income countries like Canada, Norway, Australia next door to us, who have become rich off these natural endowments. We see other countries so rich in natural endowment and yet the citizens so poor and the elites so wealthy. So this isn't right. And if EITI has a mission, it's to try to, support countries to come along the spectrum of good governance, so that the resources which should flow into a public treasury can flow and can then be allocated for the benefit of people. So in a nutshell, that is why it matters, and that is why all these years since the EITI was established, after the Lancaster House Conference convened by Tony Blair and Claire Short, I understand after one of a number of outrages around corruption in the Angolan extractive sector, EITI started its mission and over time developed the standard and has refined and improved and extended the standard. And the standard sets the best practice for good governance around more and more disclosure of contracts, beneficial ownership, payments, where do they go, how are they spent. And I think critical also in good governance is this notion of inclusion. And EITI is founded on that tripartite structure, which says civil society is going to sit there as an equal partner with industry and with government. That's inclusive governance. The Sustainable Development Goals were mentioned earlier, and of course, human development is an important part of them. Environmental protection and conservation is an important part, and so is SDG 16 on good governance, that countries and citizens have a right to have honest, non-corrupt, transparent and inclusive governance. And in its own way, niche way in the sector, that's what EITI is about encouraging.
Very clear, Helen, thank you. Philippe, would love your perspective. I don't know if many people will know this, but you, of course, started your career linked to the European Commission. So you've, of course, seen the workings of the Commission. And over the last many years, you've been building the company that is now Orano. And I think you operate across the spectrum of countries that would sit in the transparency index that Helen mentioned. So just love your perspective on this question too.
Yeah, indeed, we operate mines on 4 continents, from Kazakhstan to Niger, and partnerships in Canada, and we are exploring in more various countries like Mongolia and Uzbekistan. I would start with saying that we support EITI since its creation, so nearly 20 years now. And we indeed publish a number of figures where you would find that, for example, the economic margin which has been generated in Niger over the last 50 years, has gone to 85% to the government in terms of taxes, dividends, and over royalties. And that is important, talking about this return to the government. But of course, good governance goes beyond that. And Sunita has mentioned that a good dialogue, both at national level and at subnational level, is important to know what matters to the citizens that Helen Clark referred to. And for us, therefore, for example, in Niger, we have 1,500 employees approximately. We do invest also in infrastructure. We do not only pay taxes, we invest in infrastructure. And when I say that, it's not only roads, it's not only water, it's also health and education. Probably the most important thing we do, because for that investment to last after we are gone, maybe the mine, one mine closes now, the other one is going on. But the important thing is that our benefit to the citizens goes on. And in the city, there's a city nearby, 120,000 people. I mean, it used to be only a few thousand, but it's now 120,000. And the literacy rate, I mean, the level of education measured by the literacy rate is 52% in this city. Not as high as we would love, but nevertheless, the national average in Niger is 29%. So we see the results of what we do in terms of providing schools, books, teachers, training. For doctors also, I mean, access to health is to 84% of the people versus a national average of 48%. And while being in the desert and still having the same access to potable water than on average in the country. So, and why is it so? Because the dialogue with the local communities help us to identify what was really important to them. And I mentioned 3 aspects beyond taxes, of course, for aspects that are very important. But at my last meeting, I was there 3 months ago, and at the last meeting I had with the communities there, they also mentioned the importance for a the living together and the security. I mean, some of the ethnical groups had fights in the past, and with the economic benefits, with all what we mentioned on health, it also contributes to security in the area at this stage, and that is also a kind of secondary benefit, but that is really important for the population. And of course, if you have bad governance, I mean, security is also something that suffers.
No, thank you, Philippe, and thanks in particular for diving into education and health and infrastructure as sub-themes, because when you read the report, you'll be able to see how actually, if you break it down by SDG, you can see the relationship between good governance and individual issues like the ones you just described. So people may want to dig into that. Lisa, you of course started your career in oil and gas, and that was in the Caribbean, and then of course in Brazil and London, and now you're in Australia. So you've seen this around the world too, and you've seen it in another resource intensive sector, oil and gas. So yeah, I would love your perspective on this question.
I think, Ro, as I come to this, there are really two sides to this equation. As you operate as a company, whether it's oil and gas or as I am now in mining, it's really to ensure that the investments that you are making within the country and the community redounds to the benefit of the communities in the country. And the second perspective is that the governance of the host jurisdiction is able to attract and maintain this investment. So if I think about Newcrest, for example, it's built into the DNA of the organization in terms of how we operate. And if you look at our internal governance, we're committed to high quality governance and the role that it plays in translating finite natural resources into sustainable development within the country and specifically within the communities in which we operate. Our recently set out company purpose, for example, speaks about creating a brighter future for people through safe and responsible mining. So it's at the headline of what we're doing, and it's also embodied into how we operate. Our code of conduct sets out the behaviors that underpin all of our relationships, and our legal governance framework ensures that we operate in a legal and responsible way in relation to, for example, anti-bribery and corruption, fraud, sanctions, supplier due diligence, and so on, and doing so very transparently. Having these frameworks in place internally ensures that there is equal opportunity, fairness, and progress within the community in which we operate. Transparency is extremely important, and having a good grievance process allows us to listen and continuously improve, but also give that voice to civil society so that the dialogue is continuing. If I think about the second perspective on host jurisdictions, we are also actively engaging in policy dialogue in relation to regulatory reform with all of the stakeholders within the jurisdictions, trying to create and preserve an environment conducive to investment. Stability and prospectivity both attract investment. The more stable, the better. And if material changes are required, they should be applied prospectively, because if countries get this wrong, they can then discourage the investment that is so needed for things like health, sanitation, better water, better education. Mining companies, if I think about that, will go to deploy capital where the best overall economic return is, and a competitive and stable tax system is important for us. So a tax system that's stable and competitive will promote growth, boost jobs, income growth, and contribute to tax revenues of the country, which can then be deployed into health, education, and social safety nets. So it's really forging that partnership on both sides of the governance and creating not just the internal framework that allows us as companies to do the right thing, but also working with all stakeholders to create the right enabling environment.
Ro, can I come in for one second?
Please.
I just want to note, I think it's great that we're really highlighting the opportunities for good governance for countries and for people. But I just also wanted to note that good governance can really bring better returns for companies as well as citizens. And I was just reading the PwC Mind 2021 report, which actually noted that companies with higher ESG ratings actually outperformed the broader market during the peak of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think it's just important to note it's really good for business, but also good for people and for governments. Thanks.
No, Cindy, thank you. That's such an important framing of it, which sometimes gets lost if we just look at it through that one lens. I actually want to pick up on something else you said, Cindy, which was really interesting in your opening, where you talked about how in some parts of the world, we may have seen some backsliding in governance. I mean, the kind of numbers of people that have slid back into poverty is tragic. And if that's accompanied with a backsliding in the quality of governance, that then creates additional challenges. So I'm going to ask all of you to just reflect back in what these days feels like a very, very long time, because I'm going to ask you to look back 25 years, not just months. So if you look back 25 years, because that's what this report does, it tracks development over that period of time. So look back 25 years and tell me what progress we've made in strengthening governance over that period. And Helen, I think we'll start with you, please. Helen, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah, well, look, I think there has been progress from a standing start. EITI as an organisation out to recruit member countries, companies and civil society, now has 55 member countries, and we actually have a queue of others who would like to come in. We don't agree to everyone because we want to know that certain conditions are satisfied, and a key condition for us is, can civil society operate freely? Because unless that tripartite structure can work, then EITI can't do its magic. And I should say that where we see civil society very adversely affected by developments in a country, we will act, as we did earlier this year after the coup in Myanmar, where people involved in EITI processes at civil society level have been among those targeted by the military government. Now, the government, of course, claims that it wants to continue with EITI and the work, but it has not now got an enabling environment in which civil society can operate. So the suspension of Myanmar from the initiative continues, and others are not allowed into EITI because that enabling environment's not there. So it is a bit distressing to see stop go with a country like Myanmar, because Myanmar had, clearly very corrupt extractive sector under the dictatorship in the past. Then it has been through a kind of transitional democracy phase that came to a juddering halt. And so things that were possible in the transitional democracy phase are now on the back burner. So unfortunately, what we see in development in general is that you don't have linear evolution. You can have fits and starts and fits and starts. And all the more important, I think, for organizations like the EITI to keep their focus, keep their gold standard, and say, we want you to play, in this court, which promotes good governance, but you have to meet some criteria to do that. But anyway, as I say, 55 countries in it. And also we see strong demand from citizens and communities wanting to understand what the social contribution and economic contribution of extractives in their countries is. We have well-informed civil society groups that want to know how much is paid and where it goes. They want to see what the employment and other spillover impacts are that are positive. So I think in general, we see a lot of countries have stronger policy frameworks and institutional frameworks. And take countries like Ghana and Timor-Leste, which have gone down the sovereign wealth fund route with the revenue from their extractives. That is a best practice with Norway, best practice from Botswana, which actually isn't in the initiative, but would qualify very quickly. But that's positive, so that citizens can see, no, someone's not taking all the money and frittering it away. There's going to be money, put aside for the longer term and for development. I think we can also say that the multi-stakeholder dialogue is extremely important. It's not easy. It's not easy at the global level. It's not easy at the country level. Everyone has to learn how to operate and build trust in that sort of environment, and it requires all to tango, and some are readier to tango than others are. So, let's say progress fits and starts. Overall, the trend is good, but let's not relax our focus on the importance of good governance and transparency and an explicit anti-corruption focus. And that's where EITI has been applying more attention recently, because the way it had developed over time, the main focus was transparency. But in my humble opinion, and I think it's one shared by a number, transparency is important, but in itself insufficient. It has to be acted on. It has to be applied to ensure that things really are on the right track. So that would be my conclusion. We've made progress. We're not where we were. There are more countries which could benefit from coming into the initiative, who at the moment are seeing the birthright of their citizens plundered for private gain, and for the gain, frankly, of companies controlled by military and other oligarchical elements in societies. But we have a strong basis from which to build.
Very clear. Thanks, Helen. Lisa, your reflections in the last 2.5 decades.
I think as I look at it, progress takes time, of course, but if we take, as you said, take stock 25 years, I mean, the changes have pretty much been revolutionary. If you look where we stand now, the changes in anti-bribery and corruption laws, modern slavery and human rights, supplier due diligence requirements, climate change and transparency have all moved the mining industry forward. And it's also facilitating building trust between host governments and companies, and goes towards spreading the benefits of mining more broadly. If I think about Newcrest and PNG over the last decade, we have strengthened our governance. We have implemented new compensation, relocation, and benefits sharing agreements with the mining lease area landholders, and a new governance distribution framework for funds, which allows a broader range of community stakeholders to have a seat at the table. This goes a long way to enabling, again, the civil society voice and encouraging that dialogue. If I look here in Australia, and we consider the impact of the 2018 Modern Slavery Act, it has mandated a publication of annual modern slavery statement every year. And this has grown awareness and dialogue, not just within companies, but across the global supply chains, to both identify and manage modern slavery risks and human rights more broadly. That hadn't been there 20 years ago. There's now an acute growing sense of public expectation for companies to prevent and address human rights in a very different way. And this has especially been so in the last year as we looked through the pandemic, where the risks became even more heightened for human rights violations. There's also increasing investor focus. Someone spoke about the ESG focus, and the increasing investor focus in the last decade has really brought front and center the requirements of good governance and disclosure regarding climate change, and prompting companies to now more proactively manage and reduce their emissions, and have more effective water management and stewardship programs. These are all very important elements of social well-being and sustainable development. So I think the alignment between shareholders, management, the interest groups, and civil society has moved forward in the last 25 years, but I think there is still much work to do.
And Lisa, we're going to come to what that work is in a minute. Now, Sunitha, in addition to life experience, you have a superpower to answer this question, which we don't have, but we were able to use for this work, which is your resource governance index. So you're systematically actually tracking how governance has changed over time. So tell us what that work has shown you about progress over the last 2.5 decades.
Thanks so much, Ro. I love having superpowers. It's a wonderful thing. Well, what I think is really interesting is that ICMM and NRGI and EITI are kind of on this shared journey. This 25-year time period that you mentioned is really when we were founded, and the progress that we've been making has been really collective. And so it's nice to be able to share some good news these days in terms of what progress we're seeing. I want to underscore what both Helen and Lisa said, that fundamentally, we have seen a massive shift in who has a seat at the extractives governance table. And this is really tremendous. I mean, management of the sector was initially just viewed as this purview of the companies and the governments, and opacity was very clearly the norm. Decision-making happened behind closed doors, and citizens felt that impact, but they didn't really have the opportunity to influence these decisions that were being made on their behalf. What has partially enabled this, I must say, is not only the EITI, but certainly at the global and country level, that has been a big factor, but also the capacity of civil society to engage in really meaningful debates, not only to be a constructive critic, but also really a reform partner. And I think as a result, some of the things that we're seeing from ICMM companies today, like your annual engagement of the tax working group in civil societies, just frankly wouldn't have happened 25 years ago, both because companies wouldn't have been willing to engage, but also because civil society organizations wouldn't have necessarily had the knowledge and capacity to do so. So I think that's really pretty tremendous. We are also seeing this growing trend of transparency emerging as a new norm. And that, again, is a transformative shift that recognized that opacity was really bad for business and bad for government and ultimately bad for citizens. We had this initial focus on payments and some key wins in key markets. There are, of course, persistent gaps in Australia and weak rules in places like the US, or uneven implementation in EITI, but still that's a new norm that has been established. We've seen a major advancement in contract transparency. Orano actually and Rio Tinto, of course, are both leaders on this front. We've seen an expansion of transparency around beneficial ownership, including at the subcontractor level, now with BP's plans to disclose some supplier information. And we're seeing these emerging norms around commodity trading with Glencore and SOE disclosures and subnational payments. So this transparency gains as measured by our index we're really seeing come to the fore. But we've also seen positively, and I think this comes out in the report as well, good gains and in laws and policies for both companies and countries. And there's more work to be done. As many have said, implementation takes time. We haven't actually released our 2021 Resource Governance Index yet, but I'll give you a sneak preview. The preliminary analysis shows an interesting trend. Back in 2017, the index had revealed that good laws exist on paper, but then the practice is really falling short. That's that implementation gap that we talk about. And this was especially true, I should say, in environmental and social impacts, and particularly in subnational revenue sharing. But now, when we assess the implementation gap, we see that on a positive note, there are actually more and better laws on the books. Now, the downside is we're still seeing that gap between law and practice, and in some ways it's growing because there's a bit of an implementation lag. But the point is, progress is being made, and if we pay attention to implementation, the benefits of those good laws and policies will actually be realized. One thing I just want to note, though, it's not only governments that are guilty of this implementation gap, companies are too. And we saw this in the 2020 Responsible Mining Index. One of the key findings was that since the 2018 version, a lot of companies had actually made positive commitments on economic and environmental and social governance issues, and a few had even had stronger management standards. But there's still this disconnect where companies are showing less movement to actually translate that into actual practice. And so I think what we need now is really to be able to defend and consolidate the gains that we've made, to build on them, and to close this implementation gap.
Very helpful, Sunita. Thank you. Philippe, give us your sense of how you've seen things change. I mean, in that time, Orano as a company has changed so much, but give us your sense of how the environment's changed.
Yeah, and I would probably underline 4 points there. They have been addressed, but I want to just to give our kind of the way we live it, as was mentioned, on transparency. We have committed to publish all our contracts with states, to make them public, except if we are impeded by law. And 25 years ago, there was not even a discussion about making contracts public. So, and it's not easy. Sometimes it goes back to history, so it needs some work to maybe start on a new base, more mature, both from authorities and companies basis. But we consider that it is important for transparency, and we thank EITI to go that way. Second point, anti-corruption, anti-bribery. This is key. Not only the measures have evolved, but also the implementation, as was mentioned, is key. And the depth into which we go into risk analysis, into training, the depth in the teams where we go, so that, I mean, if there is a bribe somewhere, an accountant might see it. And if he feels that he can alert, then you might avoid it. And I think the depth in which we go, we have been accused of bribery in the past, and we are faced with legal proceedings for the former company. So we take that very seriously, and we think it's key for us in both short, long term, ethically, and also to get the right returns to the citizens. So the depth in which this code of conduct and ethics are not only on the paper, but are implemented has changed a lot. At least that's what we do, and that we intend to continue doing. Third thing is local involvement. We have local committees with authorities and stakeholders in all the countries where we operate. It used to be tricky. People felt at unease to do that. And now we have reached a level of maturity where people know that a company needs to make profit long term, but also needs that it has duties towards the population. And it's very more mature discussions that we're having now than probably my predecessors had 20 years ago. Last but not least, and I think it's a major move in the last 25 years, Sunita mentioned that ESG companies could perform better than others. And I think for us, we mine uranium for low carbon electricity around the world, but we have few customers, only 15 in the world, and 10 that have a 50% share. And they are, during the COVID crisis and before, they are valuing a responsible miner. And even if there are called for tenders or where the price is important, there are more and more points in the tenders coming for companies that are acting as responsible miners, as we do as member of ICMM and EITI. So we see an economic benefit of being in a position to explain what we do and to show that good governance matters to us. And it's doesn't make a huge difference, but the trust of your customer is also built on this. And we have customers for decades in the past and in the future. So that is a benefit for the company that should not be forgotten. And that is much more obvious now than probably 25 years ago.
Philippe, thanks for the candor and thanks for the specificity, both really, really helpful. Look, we've got a bunch of questions coming in, so we're going to get to that in a minute. Let's just touch on one theme. So we all gather again, we're in 5 years or 10 years, whichever one you want to pick. And we're thinking back to this day and everything that happened since then. What would feel like we've made progress? You know, what's still to be done? If we were back here in 5 years, what would you hope has happened that has changed governance for the better? Who's done it? How have they done it? What are the things you'd like to see in the next few years happen? So Helen, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think consistent with the findings in the survey, we'd want to continue to see an upward trajectory in human development in countries as a benefit of better governance. I think we would also want to see more universal adherence to good environmental standards. I think that would be important. I think we would want to see all countries implementing the EITI able to show that they can be fully validated as meeting the standard with all the new requirements around beneficial ownership disclosure, which is tricky to get the laws right on that, and on contract disclosure. So we'd want to see, higher performance and higher benefit. I think that would be the key thing for me. I mean, clearly there's still work to do. Progress is uneven, but it does interest me that regardless of how hard it is to get satisfactory progress against the EITI standard, countries still queue up to be part of it, and that says to me that it is important, at least to reform-minded elements in countries, and also that if you can get extractive sector governance right, that can be a lever for other policy reforms in a government, and that's highly desirable as well. So those would be the kind of benchmarks I would be looking for.
Very helpful. Thanks, Helen. Philippe?
Yeah, I would share the view that I don't know if it's universality, but at least internationally agreed standards are really a route to follow, even on reporting. As investors do care more and more about ESG, they also ask for reportings, and there are on certain areas dozens of standards, not only for, of course, the mining or extracting industries, but applicable to everybody. And we really, as a company, even struggle for that because it can be a source of suspicion or litigation. So this year we decided to issue a report on discrepancy against the different reporting standards we are committed to. So having international standards so that we have both a level playing field and we reduce the level of suspicion can be good. Of course, the initiatives we talked about today are going into the direction of standards, but we really need to focus more and more on this so that to, again, assure maturity, the right dialogue level, and etc. And if we keep using time to just reconcile certain standards of reporting, it's just a lot of time. And then, of course, local implementation will still be a challenge. As was mentioned before, you have your progress, but sometimes you have a hiccup, and keeping the long-term view, what we do with local dialogue in Kazakhstan, for example, keep going on local dialogue and local, and people change, of course, in the company or outside. So you need to keep the effort on local implementation.
Philippe, thank you. I'm actually going to come back to you in our first question, because the first question that's come through is actually about the connection between national and local. And maybe you can tell us a bit more about the Kazakhstan example in a minute. Lisa, and then Sunita, just your reflections on big things you want us to, want to see change over the next few years.
I think Philippe hit it on the head with regard to convergence and focus. There is a wide range of issues to continue to work on, but there are also a wide range of standards and often competing reporting requirements, etc. So I think there's so many issues that we have to keep focusing on, but to get that collaboration between governments, civil societies, companies, regulatory bodies with some more focus and convergence so that there's uniformity. And then if we also think about how we engage with cultural heritage management, that's a big thing for us. How you engage with indigenous peoples and to preserve their rights and hear their voice. We each have our part to play in that. I think if you think about climate change, for example, most companies are talking about an aspiration of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But the ability to really underpin that with a pragmatic roadmap to get there is also quite important in the upcoming years. And then the regulatory and disclosure framework so that we're reporting and people are understanding what's happening with that. It gives everyone the information to be able to then have their voice in, participate, collaborate, and move things forward much more quickly. So I think those would be the big things that I'd say we need to work on going forward.
Lisa, thank you. Sunita, what does your agenda look like?
Thanks so much. And just been thinking through this conversation again about this parallel rise of EITI and the civil society movement and the ICMM alliance. And I think what's really interesting is what unites us now is this recognition of the importance of mining governance for sustainability for the planet, for economic recovery. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for partnership here if we can actually seize it. And there's a couple of different lines of partnership that I can think of. One, absolutely, as echoed by others, this notion of supporting the effective scale up of and stable supply of critical minerals. As we're seeing the demand for critical minerals increase, my concern is that there are two possible scenarios that kind of emerge. And if you rejoin us 5 years from now, on the one hand, we could see that mineral-rich developing countries experience an acceleration of corruption, an acceleration of political instability and resource dependency that really characterized previous commodity booms, particularly in oil, but also in mining. Or we have this great potential, this other scenario. The one that we have to strive for is that these producer countries actually mature their mining sectors and are able to meet demand and have those proceeds really contribute to, rather than undermine, stability and economic well-being. And I think our collective future really depends on that. But in order to achieve that, the governments and the companies who are leading supply chain initiatives have to advance forward-looking anti-corruption and governance standards. And I wanted to highlight just one measure because it came up in the conversation around contract transparency. Absolutely, disclosure of mineral contracts and licensing is key to support public oversight, and we've made so much progress. But there are still 18 members of ICMM who do not have a supportive position on contract transparency. So we have a real opportunity to finish what we've started, to be frank. The second, and again, this is where ICMM, I think, has an opportunity for leadership, is to increase engagement with Chinese bodies. We know that the supply chains through which transition minerals are flowing are highly concentrated, and China is frankly locking many of them up. I'm aware that ICMM has already been working to share its standards with different Chinese bodies, including the CCCMC, and engagement with other Chinese actors. But there's an opportunity, I think, right now to take that work further and to make sure that the business practices of ICMM and how companies manage the multitude of risks in this global climate is actually shared with Chinese actors. And there's a unique moment because we know that the CCCMC, for example, is updating its supply chain guidelines this year. And so there's an opportunity to share that good practice. And then the last thing I want to mention is support to protect civil society, which Helen had mentioned earlier as well. We've spoken of the gains that we've made in these multi-stakeholder groups, which is huge, but the picture is still quite mixed. And the flip side is, on the heels of the pandemic, we are seeing the emergence of new restrictions on civil society that can limit our ability to meaningfully engage in these spaces. One of those trends is the closure of civic space. There are 65 resource-rich countries in the world, and 41 of them are repressed or closed in terms of civic space. We're also, on the company side, seeing the emergence of strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs is what they're known as. And these are suits that are actually filed to use the risks and the costs of litigation to diffuse criticism and opposition. These have been used in the global north for some time, but we're seeing a rise of their use in the global south, particularly by mining companies. So these are areas where I think we can work together to leverage the power that we have in order to be able to advance a better future.
Sunita, wonderful, very clear. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll use your point on China actually as a jumping off point for some questions that have been coming in from folks listening about what we might do to bring in more countries and companies behind the effort. So let me pose a couple of specific questions and then just any broader reflections on how to broaden the tent, as it were. So one was actually on China, which is any other ideas for how to engage China? And Sunita, really helpful comments from you on what we as ICMM can do, but would love thoughts from any others as well, those that have experience of working in China. And then, of course, another question, and maybe Helen, this one might be for you, is whether Australia might join EITI. You know, is it in the queue that you described? So maybe Helen, you want to start there, and then Philippe, Lisa, Sunita, you guys can come in on anything China related.
Oh, look, EITI would love Australia to come in, and there have been conversations over the years about it, and also with Canada. To be fair, I think the federal structures of the countries do pose some problems because of the range of different jurisdictions. I'm sure those aren't insuperable, so the conversations need to continue because both are countries which are democratic, which have a high degree of transparency, and as I said, have delivered considerable human development benefits from resource extraction. So that'd be great to have in and share experiences. There's also a tiny lobby in New Zealand for New Zealand to become a member, which it never has. And to be honest, New Zealand probably wouldn't be a priority for the ITI because you couldn't say that the minerals and extractive sector generally is large. But nonetheless, we have a history of gold mining going back to the 1860s. And that it does create jobs and opportunity in several regions around New Zealand. The question on China is interesting. Let's be clear, the prospect of China joining the EITI, I think, would be absolutely nil. It wouldn't ask, and I think the civil society requirements really couldn't be met. But my understanding is that where Chinese companies operate in a country that has joined the EITI, they must, of course, cooperate, as all companies are expected to in that setting. I think with China, it could be useful to think about what kind of twin track diplomacy, if you like, could be done on these issues to start to open up dialogue with some of their institutions. They often, from my UNDP days, I know, quite interested in discussing global governance mechanisms and issues. So there may be some ways in there.
Thanks, Helen. Philippe, Lisa, any thoughts on broadening the tent?
As regards the last comment, I do share that there are Chinese companies quite responsibly, and some others, as in any country. But when they operate in EITI countries, that the largest leverage, and then going down the value chain and making sure that customers do value responsible mining in natural resources is certainly a lever, but at least, as I mentioned, our customers are using. And for me, customers, of course, at the end of the day, the value of a company is highly dependent from customers. And before getting even to the end customer, B2B peer pressure is for me really important. And ICMM as such can show the way. It's not about forcing people, but it's about showing the way. And when we mentioned this closing the gap between the standards, when people can find their way amongst these standards and the reporting standards, and therefore customers can say, okay, this has been done, for example, I don't know if it's good or bad, but the responsible forest or responsible cocoa or responsible coffee, they have all had initiative. Gold mining has had initiatives. I mean, you can try to have a labeling which for the end customer or for the industrial customer can broaden the tent of people who want to act progressively. Of course, customers are important and investors. For listed companies in the northern world, it's quite large, but it's not only, the problem is it's not only public company or public shared company. I mean, when you're talking about a number of countries, it's national companies that are not listed, and therefore investor pressure plays maybe less than customers down the value chain.
I think if I just add to that, Ro, it's around the participation through the entire supply chain, and the companies from China that are operating in the broader global context. There's got to be an incentive for them to be able to participate in the initiatives and the actions to be able to do business across the supply chain. I think that's, it's not pressure, but it's actually creating that incentive for them to participate and come into the tent. And I think as we look across, Philippe has talked about customers, yes, but there's also the piece around Chinese investors wanting to get into different markets and wanting to get into different countries. If the requirements of the host governments are also focused into and lined up with some of the requirements of EITI and ICMM, etc., you create that environment that's much more conducive for Chinese companies to start to participate, and they can actually then create that lever for China as a whole down the road.
Wonderful. Look, I'm going to be very unfair to all of you because I'm going to ask you to answer this next question in a minute, which should really take an hour. But because so many questions have come in on this theme, I felt we really ought to talk about it a little, which is this point about where is effort best spent between national and local levels? Now, the obvious answer is both, but give me your single best thought about how to channel our efforts on improving governance at the national level and at the local level, and how they interact with each other. We'll do Helen, Sunita, Lisa, and Philippe can have the last word.
I think I'd make 2 points. One, it would depend on the country context and how much devolution of governance over the sector goes down to the regions or states. Some countries are quite centralized and don't devolve a lot. Others would give a lot of capacity for states, provinces to determine their destiny in these areas, in which case a bigger focus is required at that level. But secondly, I recall a visit to Eiti before we all stopped traveling because of the pandemic. We went to Peru, and we went to the region there, which has the substantial oil extractive sector. And in Peru, the revenues are, or a proportion of them are, put out through the states, and that enabled a sort of closer scrutiny at that state or provincial level of where the revenues were going. So I think that can be quite useful. It brings it closer to the citizens and is easier to engage with perhaps than at the federal level, which can be more abstract.
Very helpful. Thank you, Helen. Sunita?
Thanks, Ro. I think the most important thing is that we continue to make progress on these global norms and standards, but we now shift emphasis to the translation to the regional and the national level. And I think we sometimes have made a presumption that mechanisms like EITI will ensure that that translation is happening, and it's not enough. It's helpful, but we need to go further to make sure that we're seeing those gains actually realized at the country level.
Lisa? You're on mute, Lisa.
Yeah, I think if I come at this from a sustainable progress perspective, creating the enabling environment at the national level becomes extremely important. If you focus a lot of your efforts in the local level, you're impacting the community in which you're operating, yes, and you're changing their lives and you're creating a better future for them. However, if the enabling environment at the national level is not sustainable and the laws are not in place to create that conducive environment, what you're doing at the community level can actually be quite short-lived. So I think a lot of effort at the national level is extremely important, and as well in parallel at the local level. But the sustainable perspective actually comes from at the national level. Good laws, good reporting, good disclosure, good governance, which then finds its way down sustainably into the local communities.
Last word, Philippe.
Yes, I fully agreed with what Lisa said. And in other words, the national level is a necessary condition for all what she said in terms of laws, in terms of anti-bribery, in terms of all this. But it's not sufficient if you don't act locally with the needs of the citizens locally that they are able to express in a normal dialogue and a good, mature dialogue. So it's pretty different. Even if you don't interfere with the fiscal system, what is also good with transparency is if you say what you do, then it also helps to balance between local and national level, because you say what you do at both levels, and then internally the governance of a country can balance if it's adequate or not.
Look, huge thanks to all of you. Let's let Helen and Lisa get to bed and let the rest of you get on with your day. Hopefully a bit more inspired by the progress that's been made to date, excited about the things we still have to work on, and hopefully a bit more informed about these really interesting connections between mining, governance, and social progress. So look, to all of you, huge thanks. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sunita, for joining us. And bye, everybody. Hope to see you soon.